Part 1 of 1984 is about how, in its quest for power, the party exerts control over the citizens of Oceania by stepping out of what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao. It's the doctrine of objective value, the idea that some things are universally good and other things are just wrong. The Tao is a moral law that transcends culture, time and place, or your own personal view of things. And based on what we find in 1984, George Orwell agrees. In Part 2, we will see how Winston Smith resists the conditioning of the party and actively seeks to regain his humanity, body, mind, and soul. That Winston Smith represents humanity, there's very little doubt. His surname is the most common in the English-speaking world, and it suggests that he is everyman. His Christian name links him to none other than Winston Churchill, and this suggests that he is also exceptional, a man for his time. And that means he will receive the special attention of the party to bring him back in line. Much later in the book, O'Brien refers to Winston as the last man. And this fits with how C.S. Lewis sees what a human being is. Winston is a man because he has a mind, and he has an inclination toward proper sentiments. Another way of saying this is that he is the only person that retains a belief that some things lie outside the control of the party. Objective value, a universal morality, the Tao. Winston's primary motive is to remain human. He says this more than once. His rebellion against the party is nothing less than his assertion that he is human, in body, mind, and emotion. Let's start with Winston's physical rebellion. Winston's rebellion against the reality promulgated by the party begins in his body. As he reflects on the physical realities of life in Oceania, he becomes aware of a bodily discontentment. There is a mute protest in his own bones, the instinctive feeling that the conditions he lived in were intolerable. In his stomach and in his skin there was a sort of protest, a feeling that he had been cheated of something that he had a right to. He takes this as a sign that this is not the natural order of things. And he concludes that the only reason for this feeling is that he has some kind of an ancestral awareness of how life ought to be. This awareness has been part of humanity throughout human history. It is the awareness of the Tao. A symbol of Winston's bodily protest is his varicose ulcer. It shows how his body is in rebellion against the unnatural conditions of life in Oceania. In her physical relationship with Winston, Julia helps him to overcome his alienation from his body through her own. Julia is in many ways a foil to Winston. Where he uses intellect to rewrite the past, she fixes the machines that write novels. Where he is idealistic, she is pragmatic. He believes in a world he can imagine, but she lives in the world that she can see. She's a rebel from the waist down, and he from the neck up. In her role as foil, Julia's physical presence reconnects Winston to his own body from which he has been alienated. Early in their relationship, while Winston dwells on their inevitable death, Julia takes his hand and places it on her body and says, "Don't you like this feeling? This is me. This is my hand. This is my leg. I'm real. I'm solid. I'm alive. Don't you like this?" As Julia helps reintegrate the intellectual Winston with his own body, his health begins to improve. He gains weight, and his varicose ulcer subsides, and the process of life ceased to be intolerable. As his mind and sentiments align with the natural order of things, the Tao, his body too regains its health. Winston's relationship with Julia is also vital in his reclamation of his humanity through the rediscovery of healthy sentiments. Initially, Winston is convinced that she is an enemy, an agent of the thought police, and then he sees her trip and fall on her injured arm. Winston's reaction to this is peculiar for life in Oceania. When he sees her trip, a curious emotion stirred in his heart. In front of him was an enemy who was trying to kill him. In front of him also was a human creature, in pain and perhaps with a broken bone. Already he has instinctively started to move forward to help her. In the moment when he had seen her fall on the bandaged arm, it had been as though he felt the pain in his own body. This is huge. Winston is feeling empathy for someone he presumes to be his enemy. Julia awakens appropriate human sentiment, appropriate according to the Tao, not to the party. As their relationship develops, his emotions continue to change from the perversions instilled by the party's conditioning to those appropriate and consistent with the Tao. Their first sexual encounter is not an expression of love, because they are still locked into the negative and mostly political emotions. Their embrace had been a battle, the climax of victory. It was a blow struck against the party. But over time, especially through their regular meetings in the room over the antique shop, they come to develop love and a truly human commitment to each other. Through his relationship with Julia, Winston realizes by preserving appropriate feelings, one can remain human. Remember, it is by this middle element, the chest, the site of human sentiment, that we are human. Winston's relationship with Julia is the climax of his rebellion. But importantly, his rebellion doesn't start with Julia. Winston's first act of rebellion was buying that diary and then writing in it. Remember what he writes about that first time? While at the flicks, Winston sees a scene that provokes a powerful emotion, and this emotion is evoked by a simple gesture. In the film, a helicopter attacks and destroys a refugee ship, and then proceeds to kill the people in the water and in the lifeboats. In his diary, Winston writes, "There was a middle-aged woman sitting in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. Little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head between her breasts, as if he was trying to burrow right into her. And the woman put her arms round him, and comforting him, although she was blue with fright herself, all the time covering him up as much as possible, as if she thought her arms could keep the bullets off of him." Winston recounts this scene in his diary, but he has no idea why. Eventually, he realizes that the woman's protective gesture is futile, but it is, in part, its futility that makes it remarkable. In the action is the sense that you loved someone. You loved him, and when you had nothing else to give, you still gave him love. This gesture, which has no practical or political value, gives Winston the key to his humanity. It reveals the Tao. That an action could have value in itself is precisely the assertion that Lewis makes in his discussion of the Tao. For it is by the Tao that the action has meaning. The value of an action is not simply an emotional attribution to it by a human subject. The value is inherent in the action. Lewis says that until recently it was generally accepted that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or contempt. Orwell, it seems, is objecting to this recent shift as well. As Winston's awareness of his own proper sentiments increases, he becomes more aware of proper sentiments outside of himself. The party represents only 15% of the population of Oceania. The largest portion of the populace is the Proles, who are regarded as animals by those in the party. Initially, Winston, too, easily declares the Proles not human, but his attitude begins to change. He realizes that in all questions of morals, the Proles were allowed to follow their ancestral code, a reference to the Tao. Because they have retained universal morality, the Proles also have retained the idea of objective value. And Winston is drawn to this idea. The Proles were governed by private loyalties which they did not question. What mattered were individual relationships, and a completely helpless gesture, an embrace, a tear, a word spoken to a dying man could have value in itself. The Proles have maintained a standard against which all things might be judged. Because they hold on to the primitive emotions that he and the party suppress, Winston realizes that the Proles are in fact human, and he, along with the other members of the party, are the ones who are not. The problem with the Proles is that they have no intellect. Their chariot has no charioteer. That's Winston's thing. Winston also rebels against the party intellectually. While the Proles still retain appropriate emotions, they lack the intellect to direct them, so they represent no threat to the stability of society. They cannot rebel. Winston, on the other hand, is a threat, because he is able to reason. From the start, it's clear that he was not particularly adept at doublethink. Doublethink requires rejecting the evidence of your own eyes and ears, as Winston says. This he was unable to do. He could not accept the idea that there was no such thing as objective reality, or an objective past. When he considered such things, the abyss opened beneath his feet. One time, Winston possesses material evidence that the party was lying. The photo of the 3 rebels who were executed on evidence which the photo refuted. Winston dwells on this photograph for what it represents: objective reality. He wasn't able to doublethink it away. The room above Mr. Charrington's shop, significantly an antique shop, is important, not just emotionally but intellectually as well. For it is here that Winston finds a way to control his present. And who controls the present controls the past. Eventually, Winston comes to understand that the party's alteration of the past is a denial of human rationality, because it is a denial of objective reality. Winston understands how important this distortion of reality is, and so does the party. That's why it will not tolerate objective reality. If gravity exists, then the state itself would be subject to it, and absolute power would not be possible. This means that gravity cannot exist. from the perspective of the party. Winston understands what's at stake, and he realizes that in the end the party would announce that 2 + 2 make 5, and you would have to believe it. Winston then establishes a new victory condition in his battle with the party. Freedom is freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. Winston stakes everything on the existence of the Tao. So that's part 2. Winston has come a long way in reasserting his humanity, as defined by C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man. And then part 3. Well, the party is not going to tolerate this sort of thing, and it strikes back. And there's some very interesting things to look at. So thank you, and we'll see you there.